From Washington, NPACT continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, correspondent Jim Lehrer.
As soon as Senator Ervin gavels the committee back to order after a lunch break, Herbert Porter will be questioned by Assistant Committee Counsel David Dorson.
The committee will come to order. I understand the first witness will be Mr. Porter. We intend to recall Mr. Porter at a later date, and it's the hope of the chairman that at this time we will only go in to question him about his knowledge or lack of knowledge of the bugging and breaking of the Watergate and any alleged attempts to cover up that episode. The counsel will call the witness.
Yes, Mr. Herbert Porter, would you please take the witness chair?
Mr. Porter, will you stand up and raise your right hand? Do you swear that the evidence which you shall give to the Senate Select Committee on presidential campaign activities shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do, so help me
Thank
God.
you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. David Dorson, Assistant Chief Counsel, will ask the opening questions of this witness.
Mr. Porter, could you please give your full name and address?
Yes, sir. My name is Herbert Lloyd Porter, and my present address is 32451 Mediterranean Drive, Laguna Niguel, California.
Mr. Porter, I see you're represented by counsel. Could counsel please identify himself?
Charles B. Murray is my name, sir.
Mr. Porter, I understand that you have a brief opening statement. Could you please make it at this time?
I do, sir. Thank you. My full name is Herbert Lloyd Porter. I am also known as Bart Porter. I was born and reared in California. I served 2 years as an officer in the United States Marine Corps, after which I spent 7.5 years in the marketing of data processing, computers, and software. Having never been involved in any political campaign or other political activity, I was both honored and excited at the opportunity to help in some way toward the re-election of Richard Nixon to a second term in the White House. Prior to joining the Committee for the Re-election of the President in May 1971, I served a brief period in the White House working in the office of the Director of the Communications, Herbert G. Klein. My function at the Committee for the Re-election of the President was to organize the surrogate candidate program. My title was Director of Scheduling. I was also responsible for organizing all celebrities, entertainers, and athletes for the campaign. Almost all my time while at the Committee for the Re-election of the President was spent organizing and directing the activities of these several groups. Stories have appeared in both newspapers and magazines mentioning my name in connection with what has come to be known as Watergate. A few of these stories have been fairly accurate, some half true, while others have been totally false. The record will show that I have made no comments to any reporters or newsmen over the past several months. This may or may not have been wise on my part, but I was trying the best I knew how to protect my wife and my 3 children from the consequences of any excess publicity. I have cooperated fully with both the federal prosecutors and members of the investigative staff of this committee, and I have made full disclosure to them. I also wish to state that in cooperating with both the federal prosecutors and this committee, I did so voluntarily, and in the case of the federal prosecutors, I appeared at my own request. At no time did I ever seek immunity from either group, nor did I authorize my lawyer to do so. I have made no deals. I have agreed only to tell the truth. I will answer all questions put to me by this committee regarding testimony heretofore given by me. At no time did I ever have any intention of covering up a criminal act. At no time did I knowingly engage in any cover-up of the Watergate burglary. I had no prior knowledge of the Watergate burglary, and up to this very moment, I have no knowledge of the involvement of others. I have been guilty of a deep sense of loyalty to the President of the United States. The facts will speak for themselves. Finally, may I say that this whole affair has had a most devastating effect on my personal life. Because of the unfavorable publicity, I have been terminated from a lucrative position in private industry, a fact which in turn has caused me to forfeit at substantial loss the purchase of a new home in California, where I was born and plan to live. This is my situation, Mr. Chairman. I am now ready to answer any and all questions to the best of my ability.
Mr. Porter, in your opening statement, you referred to the surrogate candidate program. Could you please explain what that program entailed?
Yes, sir. Very briefly, the surrogate candidate program was a program that involved the efforts of about 35 congressmen, senators, governors, cabinet officials, a mayor, who would appear on behalf of the President during the primaries and during the campaign. The purpose of the program was to look at that group as a resource and to maximize it through scheduling and certain campaign appearances on behalf of the President.
Mr. Porter, while you were at the committee, did you know G. Gordon Liddy?
I did, sir.
And in connection with your duties at the committee, were you ever asked to give cash to Mr. Liddy?
Yes, sir, I was.
And who asked you to do this?
Mr. Jeb Magruder.
When was the first time he so asked you?
In December of 1971.
And what did Mr. Magruder tell you?
Mr. Magruder told me that Mr. Liddy was going to be taking on dirty tricks and other special projects, and that Mr. Liddy would be coming to me from time to time to request funds, and that I was to, in turn, ask Mr. Sloan for the funds and turn them over to Mr. Liddy.
Did Mr. Liddy, in fact, come to you for funds?
He did.
On how many occasions?
I would say probably 7 or 8 occasions.
And what was the approximate amount you furnished Mr. Liddy on each of those occasions?
The amounts varied, Mr. Dorson, probably for anywhere from $500 all the way up to one time I think $6,000 he requested. It was usually in the $2,000 to $3,000 category, as I remember.
Prior to April 7th, 1972, how much in total did you furnish Mr. Liddy?
Approximately $30,000 to $35,000, probably closer to the $30,000 figure, 30, 31, 32.
Now, in March of 1972, Mr. Liddy changed positions. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And what was the change?
Mr. Liddy left his duties as General Counsel of the Committee for the Re-election of the President and became General Counsel of the Finance Committee to re-elect the President.
How many of the payments which you have described occurred after he went to the Finance Committee?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood your first question. When I answered the $30,000 to $35,000 figure, that was up to April 7th. There was an additional payment after April 7th that occurred in the early part of May 1972 in the net amount of $3,300, which should be added to the other figure.
And when you say net amount, what do you mean?
Sir?
By net amount?
Net amount means that I gave Mr. Liddy $5,300 and he returned $2,000 of that $5,300 the next day.
Did Mr. Liddy ever give you receipts for the money you gave him?
Yes, sir, he did.
Did Mr. Liddy ever give you anything else?
Yes, sir, he did.
What was that?
I would say on 3 or 4 occasions, Mr. Liddy handed me white, large, regular letter-size envelopes, sealed on the back with his initials written over the seal, and asked me to keep them in my safe in my office. He instructed me that if anything should ever happen to him, that I was to take those directly to the Attorney General.
And who was the Attorney General?
Mr. Mitchell.
Did there ever come a time when you took any of these envelopes to Mr. Mitchell?
No, sir.
What happened to the envelopes?
The envelopes, and I've told you this before, I cannot remember whether it was at the end of March or after the Watergate break-in. I have a feeling it was at the end of March, but I can't be certain. It was one of the times that I went through and audited my cash on hand. Mr. Liddy came by and he said, "You know those envelopes I gave you, or that you're holding for me?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Why don't you," he said, "go ahead and shred them." I did that, and in doing so, they were stuffed full of paper of some kind and would not go through a shredder without looking inside.
Did you open the envelopes?
I did. I opened all of them. Yes, sir.
And did you see what was inside the envelope?
Yes, sir, I did, generally.
And what did you see?
I determined very quickly that they were very similar to a salesman's receipts if he went on a trip, an airline ticket, a parking ticket, a restaurant stub, that kind of thing. And so I didn't bother to look and inspect each one. There were no memos in them. I do remember, I think one of the airline tickets was from Washington to Los Angeles and back, I think.
Did you ever discuss the contents of the envelopes with Mr. Liddy?
No, sir, I did not.
Did you ever discuss the contents of the envelopes with Mr. Mitchell?
No, sir, I did not.
Mr. Porter, prior to April 7th, 1972, how much money did you receive from Hugh Sloan?
Approximately $52,000.
How much of this did you disperse?
Approximately $49,500.
After April 7th, 1972, how much money did you receive from Hugh Sloan?
Approximately $17,000.
And how much did you disperse?
All of it.
How do you now arrive at the figures which you have just given us?
Well, sir, I've had ample opportunity to go back and recall as best I know how each of the transactions in which I went and got money from Mr. Sloan and gave it to others. And to the best of my ability, I have come up with those figures.
And is it your best recollection and knowledge that you received from Mr. Sloan a total of approximately $69,000?
Yes, sir, that's to the best of my knowledge.
Mr. Porter, when did you first become aware of the break-in at the Watergate?
Saturday, June 17th, in Los Angeles, California.
And briefly, how did you become aware?
Well, sir, that was a weekend in which we were having a large party at a private residence in California for a lot of the celebrities who were going to be supporting the president during the campaign. And it was on that trip that apparently the news broke Saturday morning here and was relayed to some of the campaign officials with whom I was traveling at the time, and I learned it from them.
Following the break-in at the Watergate, did you have a conversation with Mr. Jeb Magruder concerning any statements you might make to the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Yes, sir, I did.
Where and when did this conversation occur?
I would say that approximately 10 or 11 days, I'm not sure of the exact date, whether it was June 28th or the 29th, but in that time frame. Mr. Magruder asked me to come into his office, which I did. He shut the door, and he told me that he had just come from a meeting with Mr. Mitchell, Mr. LaRue, himself, and a fourth party whose name I cannot remember, where my name had been brought up as someone who could be, what was the term he used, counted on in a pinch, or a team player or something, words to that effect.
Excuse me for interrupting, Mr. Porter, but you are now recounting what Mr. Magruder told you, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Please continue.
He said that, I believe at that time Mr. Liddy had been fired from the campaign. He said it was apparent, it was the word he used, that Mr. Liddy and others had, on their own, illegally participated in the break-in of the Watergate Democratic National Committee, and Mr. Magruder swore to me that neither he nor anybody higher than Mr. Liddy in the campaign organization or at the White House had any involvement whatsoever in Watergate, in the Watergate break-in, and reinforced that by saying, doesn't that sound like something stupid that Gordon would do? And you have to know, Mr. Liddy, I agreed with that. He said, I want to assure you now that no one did. He said, however, he said, there is a problem with some of the money. He said, now, Gordon was authorized money for some dirty tricks. Nothing illegal, he said, but nonetheless, things that could be very embarrassing to the President of the United States and to Mr. Mitchell and to Mr. Haldeman and others. Now, your name was brought up as someone who we can count on to help in this situation. And I asked, what is it you're asking me to do? And he said, would you corroborate a story that the money was authorized for something a little bit more legitimate sounding than dirty tricks? Even though the dirty tricks were legal, it still would be very embarrassing. Now, he said, you're aware that the Democrats have filed a civil suit against this committee. I said, yes, I've read that in the paper. And he said, do you know what immediate discovery is? And I said, no, I do not. And he said, well, they may get immediate discovery, which means that they can come in any minute and swoop in on our committee and take all the files and subpoena all the records. And you know what would happen if they did that. I conjured up in my mind that scene and became rather excitable, and no, I didn't want to see that. So I said, well, be specific. And he said, well, you were in charge of the surrogate campaign. He said, you were very concerned about radical elements disrupting rallies and so forth. And I said, yes. And he said, suppose that we had authorized Liddy, instead of the dirty tricks, that we'd authorized him to infiltrate some of these radical groups. He said, how could such a program have cost $100,000? And I thought very quickly of a conversation I'd had with a young man in California in December, as a matter of fact. And I said, Jeb, that's very easy. I said, you could get 10 college-age students or 24, 25-year-old students, people. Over a period of 10 months, Mr. Magruder had prefaced his remark by saying from December on, and I said you could pay them $1,000 a month, which they would take their expenses out of that. And I said, that's $100,000. I said, that's not very much for a $45 million campaign. And he said, no, that's right. He said, would you be willing, if I made that statement to the federal or to the FBI, would you be willing to corroborate that when I came to you in December and asked you how much it would cost, that's what you said? That was the net effect of his question. That was the net of his question. And I thought for a moment, and I said, yes, I probably would do that. I don't remember saying yes, but I'm sure I gave Mr. Magruder the impression that I would probably do that. That was the end of the conversation.
Now, Mr. Porter, did the conversation you agreed to tell the FBI actually take place?
Sir?
Did the conversation which you agreed with Mr. Magruder that you would tell to the FBI actually take place in December of 1971?
No, sir, it did not take place in December.
Later, did you tell the FBI what Mr. Magruder asked you to tell them?
Yes, sir, I did.
And subsequent to that, did you appear at before a federal grand jury?
Yes, sir.
And were you asked about the surrogate candidate program?
Yes, sir.
And what did you tell the federal grand jury?
Same thing, sir.
And were you a witness at the trial of the 7 defendants who
Yes,
were
sir.
indicted in the Watergate case?
Yes, sir.
And did you give the same account?
Yes, sir, I did.
Did Mr. Magruder ask you to make any other statements which you knew to be false?
Yes, sir, he did.
And what did he ask you?
Shortly after that, he asked me to, if I would increase the amount of money that I was going to say that I gave to Mr. Liddy. And I said, no, I wouldn't do that. And he said, why not? And I said, because I just absolutely, I didn't give him that amount of money, and I won't say I gave him that amount of money. I said, the conversation that you're asking me to relate, I can conceive of it happening because I would have told you that in December if you'd asked me. And a strange answer, but that's the answer I gave him. And I would not increase the amount of money. He wanted me to say that I gave Mr. Liddy $75,000, when in fact I had given him some $30,000 to $35,000, $32,000.
Yes. Did Mr. Magruder tell you why he wanted the higher figure?
No, sir, he did not.
When was the first time you told any investigatory body that you had not testified truthfully at the grand jury and at the trial?
April 18th, I believe.
1973?
1973, yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions at this time.
We have a vote on in the Senate, and so it'll be necessary for us to take a recess till members of the committee can go and vote.
The senators took a break after following some of the most startling testimony of the whole 8 days of the hearings. Herbert Porter has just indicated that he helped set up a cover story at the direction of Jeb Stuart Magruder. As the committee pauses for a vote on amendments to an agriculture bill, we'd like to thank you, the viewers, for your overwhelming response to these broadcasts. We've received more than 70,000 letters, almost 99% of them in favor of this primetime replay. We'd like to encourage viewers who might still want to offer opinions to let your local public television stations know. That's the station you're watching right now. Drop them a card or letter, or if you're so inclined, maybe drop them a check, because local stations depend on you to keep them in business and on the air. They're interested in your response, as well as your help. Public television's coverage of the hearings will continue after this pause for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of these hearings is provided as a public service by the member stations of PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. From Washington, NPACT continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, correspondent Robert McNeil.
When the hearings resumed, it was the turn of Minority Counsel Fred Thompson to go over Herbert Porter's reasons for his apparent perjury at the Watergate trial.
Mr. Thompson.
Ms. Porter, as I understand it, your statement here this morning is to the effect that you agreed with Mr. Magruder that you would tell the grand jury a false story. Is that correct?
What I agreed to specifically, Mr. Thompson, was that I would agree initially to corroborate a story that Mr. Magruder was going to tell to the FBI, which I felt was, in effect, replacing one lawful authorization for another lawful authorization.
Was it, or was it not a false story?
Oh, yes, absolutely correct. It was a false statement.
All right. Then you gave this false statement to the grand jury.
Yes, sir.
And you gave it at the trial in January.
Yes, sir.
And when did you go to the proper authorities and tell them the truth about these matters?
The appointment was on April 18th at the U.S. Attorney's Office, although the contact had been made earlier than that, or the contact to set up an appointment.
When was the contact made?
I believe the 15th.
15th?
Yes, sir.
What caused you to go to them and make that contact?
To answer that question, Mr. Thompson, would, in its context, would really cause me to go back to April 9th, when Mr. Magruder called me in New York, where I was employed, and stated that things weren't looking too good for him. And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, let me just say that things are getting a little hot down here." And I said, "Well, Jeb, I don't know what you mean by that." I said, "You've always indicated to me that you were not involved in any of these matters." And he said, "That's right." And I said, I don't want you to go into anything, but he said, "Well, I'll keep you up to date, or keep you up to speed," or words to that effect. He called me on Wednesday, and on April 11th, and said, "Bart, if I were you, I would call Paul O'Brien, who was one of the lawyers for the committee, and tell him to call Earl Silbert and go down and tell Earl what you know." I said, "Jeb, you realize you're asking me to, in effect, put one of your feet in a 6 feet deep hole." He said, "Yes, I know that, but," he said, "I got you into this," and he said, "The least I can do is help you get out of it." So I called Mr. O'Brien on the telephone.
When?
This was on April 11th. And I told him that I had had a conversation with Mr. Magruder, and I told him that I wanted him to call Mr. Silbert, and that I wanted to go talk to Mr. Silbert. And Mr. O'Brien's response to me was, "Now, what do you want to go do a stupid thing like that for?" And I said, "Well, I just do." And he said, "Well, now, just, you sound a little rattled, just calm down a little." He said, "When are you going to be back down in Washington?" I was commuting at the time. My family was here. And I said, "Well, I'll be in tomorrow evening, Thursday evening, April 12th. He said, "Well, why don't you come in and see me on Friday, 13th, and let's talk about it." And so I did. And during the afternoon, Mr. O'Brien alternately said, "Gee, I don't know whether you have a problem here or not." He was very tired. He, in fact, fell asleep a couple of times during our conversation. And I don't say that jokingly. The man was exhausted, in my opinion. I wasn't. He said, "Well, I think maybe we ought to get another opinion here." So he called Mr. Parkinson on the telephone, and there was a brief pause, and he said, "Yeah, I'll tell him that." So he said, "Parkinson thinks you should tell the truth." And I said, "Yes, that's what I called you about 2 days ago." And he said, "Well, I don't know what to tell you. We still need," and he hemmed and hawed. He then got a phone call from Mr. Magruder, who was over at his attorney's office. And they conversed briefly, and he said, "Yeah, I'll tell Porter that. That's a good idea." So he hung up and he said, "You go over and talk to Magruder's lawyer." At this point, I did not have any counsel. He said, except Mr. Parkinson and Mr. O'Brien. And he said, you go over and talk to Magruder's lawyer and see what he thinks you ought to do." So I went over to the office of Mr. James Sharp and spoke briefly with him. I would say no more than 10 minutes.
Same day?
Same day, yes, sir. This is the afternoon of the 13th now. And I explained very quickly what I've just explained to you gentlemen here, And he looked at me rather incredulously, and he said, "My God," he said, "you're an ant." He said, "You're a nothing." He said, "Do you realize the whole history of the whole course of history is going to be changed?" And I said, "No, I didn't realize that, but I knew what my worries were." And he said, he said, "I can't advise you." He said, "Do you have an attorney?" I said, "No." He said, "Do you know any?" And I said, "Well, yes, but I don't know anybody that might be able to handle anything like this or be involved." I said, "I would want somebody that you would know." He said, "I'll call you later on this evening, and give you a couple of names. You talk to an attorney and have him call me." And he said, "Now, if Mr. Magruder is going to go down and talk to the federal prosecutors," he said, "we would certainly give you the courtesy of going down first." And I said, "Well, I would appreciate that very much."
Why?
I think because Mr. Magruder is the one who got me involved, and it was Mr. Magruder's feeling, at least he indicated to me, that he wanted to do everything he could to extricate me from that situation. So Mr. Sharp did call me that evening about 10:15
Wouldn't it have
at
been
night.
better from your standpoint if you had come forth with this information first?
Sir?
Wouldn't it have been better from your standpoint if you had come forth with this information first, in your own eyes, instead of having Magruder go down there and then you coming in
No,
later?
sir, I'm explaining, perhaps you didn't understand me, I'm explaining that Mr. Sharp said to me, if Magruder is going to go down to the U.S. Attorney's office, we would certainly give you the courtesy of going first.
You're going,
he said to me.
All right.
All right. And I agreed with that. And so he called me later that evening, about 10:15, on Friday evening, Mr. Sharp did, and gave me the name of 2 or 3 lawyers here in Washington. Mr. Murray was on that list. And said, have him call me. The following Saturday afternoon, the next day, when I ran into Mr. Magruder across from St. John's Church at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, among other things, he told me that he had been to the U.S. Attorney's office that morning, Saturday morning. And I was rather stunned by that. And I said, how did that happen? And he said, well, Jim Sharp called me last night and said that he had set up an appointment with Earl Silbert for 8:30 this morning and instructed me absolutely not to call anybody or discuss it with anyone. I'm sorry, he said. So,
in other words, Mr. Magruder didn't do what Mr. Sharp suggested that he do.
Mr. Magruder did not call me, sir, and tell me that he was going down. No, he followed Mr. Sharp's instructions according to what he said.
Mr. Sharp told him what again?
Mr. Magruder told me Saturday afternoon that his lawyer, Jim Sharp, had called him the night before and had told him that he had made an appointment for Mr. Magruder to see the federal prosecutors the next morning, Saturday morning, April 14th, at 8:30 in the morning, and instructed Mr. Magruder, according to Mr. Magruder now, not to contact anybody or call anybody or discuss his meeting with anybody at all. And
so Mr. Sharp didn't abide by the agreement that you and he had had?
Well, in my opinion, no, sir.
What did Mr. Magruder tell you there on the 14th? Besides what you've already related?
Yes, sir. Mr. Magruder told me that he had just come from a meeting at the White House and that it's all over, he said. And I said, what do you mean it's all over? And he said, it's all over. He said, the President has directed everybody to tell the truth, were his exact words. He said, I had a meeting with Mr. Ehrlichman, and I told him the whole story, and boy, was he really shocked, or words to that effect. He also told me that he had been to the federal prosecutors that morning. He also told me that there were going to be several indictments and listed off a series of names, number of names of people that he thought would be indicted.
All right, I'm sure that will produce some further questions, but I'll leave it for others on that particular point. Let me ask you this. When is the first time you talked with Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Parkinson about this false story concerning the $100,000 of Mr. Lee?
I talked to Mr. Parkinson. Well, the way it happened was a few days, I would say maybe 2 or 3 days after Mr. McCord's letter to Judge Sirica was made public in the latter part of March. Mr. Magruder called me on the phone. I was still in my office at the inaugural committee, and said, did you see McCord's letter? And I said, yes, I saw parts of it in the newspaper. And he said, well, what do you think of it, or words to that effect? And I said, well, I'm not really concerned about any part of it. I said, I don't think he's not talking about me. And he said, Mr. Magruder said, well, yeah, I guess he isn't, or something like that. He said, oh, by the way, Mr. Parkinson, or Ken Parkinson, wants to talk to you. And I said, what about? And he said, well, I'm not sure, but he said, let me just say one thing. He said, when you do talk to Parkinson, he said, tell him everything. And I said, and I was a little startled at that. I said, all right, I will. I had occasion, Mr. Parkinson and I set up, he did call me, Mr. Parkinson did, and we set up an appointment, I believe it was for 4 o'clock in the afternoon of March 28th.
Was this meeting before you went to the grand jury?
Sir?
Was this meeting before you went to the grand jury?
I've only made one grand jury appearance.
When was that?
August of 1972.
All right. Go ahead.
So I had occasion to talk to Mr. O'Brien before I went to Mr. Parkinson's office, and he asked me to come by his office. I did. I talked to Mr. O'Brien, I would say for an hour, hour and a half in his office, told him my whole story, or what I've told this committee. Mr. O'Brien said he didn't think I had a problem, I think was the way he put it. I went to see Mr. Parkinson. Mr. Parkinson began by asking me what I knew about Mr. McCord's letter to Judge Sirica. And I said, well, quite frankly, Ken, I don't see where I can't really shed any light on it at all. And then I said, however, you're aware of, and then I told him about the false statement, or the statement that was not true. And he looked at it. I believe he had my trial testimony in front of him. I'm not certain of that, however. I can't be certain. But I do remember him sitting back, and he said, all you've done is you've just embellished a little. He said, that's all. He said, you haven't got a problem. He said, you have nothing to worry about. I said, well, I felt a little uneasy, although I felt better after that. I said, do you think I should have my own attorney? Up to this point, Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Parkinson were, in their representing the committee, were made available to anybody who was making FBI appearances or grand jury appearances, etc., and in connection with the civil suit filed by the Democrats. And I said, do you think I need my own attorney or my own counsel? And he said, well, you certainly can. It probably costs you a little money maybe. But he said, I don't see why you need your own counsel. He says, as a matter of fact, Bart, at this point it would probably be a little disruptive because things are, kind of coming down to a close, and it would take somebody new a long time to learn the case. We've been on this thing for many months now, and he said, I don't think we have any conflict of interest here representing your interest in this thing at all. So I walked away, and that was it.
So you never discussed the matter with Mr. Parkinson or Mr. O'Brien before August of '72?
Well, I'm not sure in what context you're asking.
You never discussed the story that you were going to tell the grand jury?
Yes, I did, sir. Yes, I did, but in a slightly different context. Back in July, or late June, early July of '72, Mr. Magruder said to me that Mr. Parkinson wanted me to write a statement just on regular yellow legal pad.
Let me ask you this. Maybe I can short-circuit it a little bit. Did you tell either of these men before you went to the grand jury in August of '72 that you were going to tell a false story?
No, sir, I did not.
All right. Let me ask you one other line of questions, and then I will pass it on to the chairman. Your testimony at trial, of course, dovetailed almost completely with what Mr. Liddy testified to at trial, as was planned. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, sir.
It dovetailed.
Mr. Liddy did not testify at the trial.
I don't mean Mr. Liddy, Mr. Magruder. As far as $100,000 was concerned,
I have never seen Mr. Magruder's testimony at the trial. Never read it, and do not know what that testimony is.
I'll read you a question from the trial transcript.
Is this my testimony?
No, this is Mr. Magruder's
Yes, sir.
testimony. The question, what funding or financial arrangements did you agree upon with Mr. Liddy with respect to the two different assignments that you just described? Answer, on the first assignment, we agreed to a funding of approximately $100,000 for the 10-month period starting in January. And on the convention program, we agreed to $150,000 or so, a total funding of $250,000. With regard to the $100,000, he was talking about the surrogate candidate program or protection for the surrogate candidates.
Yes, sir. I
So,
assume he was.
assuming that is a fact, then that would dovetail with essentially with what you testified
Yes,
to.
sir, that's
Is
correct.
that correct? All right. How many times did you discuss this matter with the Mr. Silbert, Mr. Glanzer, Mr. Campbell?
I made one grand jury appearance in August of 1972, and discussed it with them then. And there was a pretrial meeting, I believe, the night before or 2 nights before, I'm not sure which, before the trial, that was brief in Mr. Silbert's office.
How long did it last?
I think Mr. Magruder was there for an early part of it, and then he left.
Were you both in the same room?
We were both in the same room for a brief period of time, yes, sir.
Was Mr. Sloan there at the same
No, sir,
time?
he was not.
Who else was in the room while you and
I
Mr.
believe
Magruder were there?
Mr. Magruder, Mr. Silbert, Mr. Glanzer, I think Mr. Campbell was there, I'm not sure.
All right. Then Mr. Magruder left?
Yes, sir, he did.
All right. Did any of the prosecutors ever ask you if Magruder had tried to get you to perjure yourself?
No, sir.
I have no further questions.
You talked to Magruder before you went before the grand jury in August 1972.
Yes, sir.
And you agreed to testify that during December 1971, you had told Magruder that it would require about $100,000 for the Dirty Tricks episode.
No, sir.
For what episode?
No, sir. What I testified...
That you had estimated.
Yes, sir, that's correct, but not for dirty tricks, for information gathering from radical groups.
From radical groups.
Yes, sir.
Now, Mr. Magruder had attempted to get you to swear some other things which you say were not true.
Yes, sir.
And you refused to do that.
Yes, sir.
Then you went before the grand jury and you testified in August 1972, and that's the only time you've been before the grand jury.
Yes, sir.
Then in about last of March, Mr. McCord wrote a letter to Judge Sirica, which came out in the newspapers.
Yes, sir.
And about that time that Mr. Magruder called you.
Shortly after that.
And told you things were getting hot.
No, sir, that was on April 9th.
April 9th.
Yes.
Well,
for himself, he said.
Yes. You came down to Washington after you received the phone call from Mr. Magruder?
Well, I was already planning to come down to Washington.
Now, when did you come?
On the evening of April 12th.
And was that the time that Magruder suggested to you that you go and talk to the counsel for the committee, that is Kenneth Parkinson? And,
no, sir. Mr. Chairman,
Well, when was that?
Yes, sir. I believe Mr. McCord's letter to Judge Sirica was made public in a story in the Washington Post on a Saturday morning towards the end of March, the 24th, 25th, I think, something like that.
Well, anyway, you talked to Parkinson and O'Brien on the 28th of March.
Yes, sir, I did.
And you did that at the instance of Mr. Magruder?
I've talked to Mr. O'Brien on my own. I talked to Mr. Parkinson because Mr. Magruder had called me saying Mr. Parkinson wants to see you and is going to call you to set up an appointment.
Well, did you you talked with Parkinson and O'Brien together, did you?
No, sir, not together, separately. But on the same afternoon.
Same afternoon?
Yes, sir.
And which one, you say you told them that, who was it told you that the whole course of history was going to be changed?
That was on Friday afternoon, April 13th, and that was Mr. Sharp, Mr. Magruder's,
yes.
One of Mr. Magruder's.
Well, I'll go
lawyers.
back then to Parkinson and O'Brien.
Yes, sir.
You told them, in effect, that you were troubled because of your having testified before the grand jury that you had estimated for Mr. Magruder in December 1971 that it would require about $100,000 to supervise these off-color, radical groups.
Yes, sir.
And what did Mr. Parkinson say when you talked to him about that?
When Mr. Parkinson learned that was not a true statement?
Yes.
I don't remember that he said anything other than he was taking some notes, I believe, and I probably initiated the question by saying, well, Ken, what do you think? To which he responded, Bart, he said, I don't think you have a problem at all. He said, he said, all you've done is just embellish a little.
Yeah, that's Miss Parkinson.
Yes, sir.
What did Mr. O'Brien say about it?
Mr. O'Brien said, I don't think you have a problem. He did not use any other words.
In other words, that's both of the attorneys for the committee told you after you told them that you had sworn falsely,
yes,
and before the grand jury, they said there's no problem.
That's
you
correct.
just embellished things a little.
Mr. Parkinson used those words, yes, sir.
Now, then, a short time after that, you went to see Mr. Sharp, who was the attorney of Mr. Magruder.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Sharp told you that the whole course of history is going to be changed.
Yes, sir.
Did he explain what he meant by that?
No, sir, he didn't.
But he recommended that you talk to Mr. Magruder?
No, sir, he did not. He said that it would be wise for me to retain an attorney, and that I should tell the attorney, my attorney, the same brief story that I had told him, and to have my attorney call him. And that's when then he asked me if I knew any, and I asked him that, well, since his client was the one who had in effect asked me to do that it would be helpful if he...
Well, now, did Mr. Sharp tell you that they could arrange for you to see the
yes, sir.
district attorney before
Mr.
Magruder?
Yes, sir. He stated specifically, if we decide that Jeb should go down and see Silbert, we would certainly give you the courtesy of going first.
And
Those were his exact
then
words.
you went out and you met Mr. Magruder and found out from him he'd already been to see Silbert.
Yes, sir.
Now, did you consult a lawyer, a friend of yours, after you were asked by Magruder to lie?
Yes, sir, I did.
And did he tell you that you asked him what he would do under the circumstances? He said he would probably lie for the president?
Those words were not used, Mr. Chairman.
What were used?
I stated I went to, right after Mr. Magruder had this discussion with me in late June, I went to a friend of mine who happens to be a lawyer, but I didn't go to him because he was a lawyer. And to share an experience, I think, and I stated what Mr. Magruder had said to me. We talked about it. I think you've got to project yourself back a little bit in a period of time. We were this was in the heat of battle in a campaign. We were here were two loyalists talking between each other about the prospect of having the Democrats, our quote enemy, come into our camp and bust our whole campaign wide open. And I wasn't concerned about bad things. I was concerned about things like polling and state strategy and research and advertising and all these other things that could be made public. So I told him what Mr. Magruder had asked me to do. He made a comment to me. He said, after thinking about it, he said, "What?" And by the way, I think another important thing, and if I may digress just momentarily, Mr. Chairman, I think it's very important that both of us, me particularly, since I'm the one involved, believed Mr. Magruder, had no reason to mistrust him at all, that neither he nor anybody else was involved in the Watergate. And he specifically said that it was important that the investigation be confined to the Watergate, and I didn't think that I was being asked to do anything in connection with the Watergate break-in at all. My friend said to me, he said, I think he was speaking rather rhetorically, what difference does it make whether the money was authorized for this purpose or this purpose if what they're apparently saying is that Liddy diverted funds and went off and did something illegal? If one thing is going to embarrass the President and the other one isn't, he said, I wouldn't do it for Mitchell and I wouldn't do it for Haldeman, but I'd do it for the boss. And that's the feeling I had at that time.
Was that before you testified before the grand jury?
Yes, sir.
Who was the lawyer who told you that?
Mr. Chairman, I would respectfully request that I not have to give his name at this time. My lawyer knows who it is. He's not involved in this in any way. Unless you insist on it, I would prefer not.
Did you go before the grand jury and make a statement on account of what the lawyer said to you, or on account of what Mr. Magruder had said to you?
This lawyer was also a member of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, so he was, but not acting in a legal capacity.
Well,
so he is not a...
He was a member of the Committee to re-elect the President.
Yes, sir.
I think under these circumstances you ought to divulge that.
All right, sir. His name is Curtis Herge.
Curtis who?
Herge, H-E-R-G-E.
Yes. Now, did Mr. Magruder, at the time of your conversations with him about April, tell you that he had prior knowledge of the Watergate matter?
I'm sorry, sir.
Did Mr. Magruder admit to you at the time of your conversation about April of this year that he, Mr. Porter, did have prior knowledge of the Watergate affair?
On April 14th, in the afternoon of April 14th, was the first time that I learned that Mr. Magruder had prior knowledge, or that anybody else had prior knowledge other than those that had been convicted.
Now, how did you learn that?
I deduced it from his statement that there were going to be a number of indictments, and he included his own name.
Up to that time, he had always maintained to you that he had no prior knowledge.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
And at that time, he stated to you that that probably some people would go to jail on account of the Watergate affair. And did he predict that he himself would be one of them to go to jail in all probability?
Yes, sir.
Did he say he had talked to Mitchell about the matter in addition to talking to Ergman?
Yes, sir, I think he did.
And he told you that Mitchell was had told him he was going to deny complicity to the end?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Porter, I'm not going to try to take you over the same testimony that counsel and the chairman have already covered, nor am I going to be unduly critical of your position, I trust. But rather than inquire into the factual background and the factors and circumstances that led you to swear falsely, apparently, before the grand jury of the United States District Court, rather than elaborate and expand further the situation that leads you to this witness chair today, I'd like to probe your reasons and motivations. I'd like to start with how you got into the dirty tricks business, what you thought of it at the time, and what you thought you would accomplish. And I believe that's a good place to stop. Would you tell me that, please?
The first time I ever heard the word dirty tricks, I think, was from Mr. Magruder sometime in the fall of 1971. And I had to ask him what it was. He asked me if I knew who Dick Tuck was. And I said, no, I'd never heard the name. And he described some of Mr. Tuck's activities. I then, upon reflection, remembered something out of Theodore White's book from the 1964 presidential campaign, where President Johnson had a group called the 5 O'Clock Club, I think it was, a group of 12 young attorneys and White House staffers that met in the White House every afternoon during the campaign to plan all kinds of deviltry, I think it was referred to, and dirty tricks against Senator Goldwater.
Now, let me stop you just
and
a moment.
This is what I thought dirty tricks were.
All right, may I stop you just a moment?
Yes, sir.
The chairman has explained to you and to the committee that we intend to recall you for further testimony.
Yes, sir.
And that the scope of our inquiry today ought to be on the Watergate and attendant circumstances.
Yes, sir.
I'm departing from that slightly, but I want to tell you that I'm searching for your motivations and reasons. I'm not now, at this time, searching for the facts. I will at a different time, but any insight you can give me as to why a young man with your background, with your education, with your obvious intelligence, found yourself in charge of or deeply involved in a dirty tricks operation of the campaign. I need to know more of why.
Yes, sir. I don't think I was in charge of any dirty tricks operation at the campaign. I'm not aware anybody has testified to that fact.
Well, tell me what your involvement was.
I dispensed certain monies to certain individuals at Mr. Magruder's request over the period of time from probably October of 71 until probably May or June, I guess, of 1972, some $69,000. About $52,000 of that $69,000 was given to people or persons the use of which, for purposes the use of which I did not know at the time. So approximately 75% of that money was used for purposes I did not know about. I was asked to have a quote, Dick Tuck type of individual, find one, and pay him to perform those kinds of activities that were more in the prank category. The first person that I made contact with did that for about 2 weeks, as I remember, and then decided that that was not his bag. The second person was paid for a period of about 3 months and participated in some of the primary campaigns. That was just about the extent of it.
Well, who else was doing this?
I do not know, sir.
Well, do you know of anyone else besides you who were hiring people for pranks?
No, sir, I do not.
Then As I understand the essence of your testimony at this point, then 75% of the money is unaccountable, or you cannot account for. 25% of the money you can, that you hired two men to do a, as you put it, dick-tuck operation, a so-called prank operation.
Yes,
is this synonymous with the, quote, dirty tricks operation that you referred to earlier in your testimony?
No, sir. No, sir. Mr. Magruder indicated to me that money had been, in fact, authorized to Mr. Liddy for dirty tricks and other special projects. Now, what he said was that they were not illegal, and that what Mr. Liddy had done, apparently, or what he had apparently done at that time, was illegal and was not a part of that authorization.
Did you ever have any doubt in your mind about the propriety of this?
About the what, sir?
The propriety. Not the illegality, but the propriety of it.
Well, I didn't know what he was referring to, and he didn't tell me what he was referring to. He never explained any of the dirty tricks operations that Mr. Liddy was involved in.
And I don't think that answers my question, and I'm going to
sorry.
put it again. Did you ever have any qualms about the propriety of what you were doing in hiring these people for pranks or dirty tricks or whatever it was? I'm probing into your state of mind, Mr. Porter.
I understand, sir. I think the thought crossed my mind, Senator, that in all honesty, that I really couldn't see what effect it had on re-electing the President of the United States. On the other hand, in all fairness, wasn't the one to stand up in a meeting and say that this should be stopped either.
Now let's
So I mean, there's someplace in between. I kind of drifted along with the...
You've reached now precisely that point that I'd like to examine, and I intend to examine with other witnesses as this hearing proceeds. Where does the system break down when concern for what's right, as distinguished from what is legal, is never asserted or never thought about, and you don't stand up and say so? At any time, did you ever think of saying, I don't think this is quite right, this isn't quite the way it ought to be? Did you ever think of that?
I think probably most people probably would stop and think that at some point.
Did you?
Yes, sir, I did.
What did you do about it?
I didn't do anything.
Why didn't you?
In all honesty, probably because of the fear of group pressure that would ensue of not being a team player.
And the fear of not being a team player was strong enough to suppress your judgment on what action you should take if you considered an action improper, if not illegal.
Well, I never considered any action up to that point illegal, number one. However...
Do you think that an organization, a political organization, should be so anonymous, so military and obedient, so careful for the concerns of peer approval, that each and every member of that organization, at least up unto a certain point and level in the organizational chart, completely abdicates his conscience and judgment?
No, sir, I certainly do not.
What caused you to abdicate your own conscience and disapproval, if you did disapprove, of the pranks or dirty tricks operation?
Well, Senator Baker, my loyalty to this man, Richard Nixon, goes back longer than any person that you will see sitting at this table throughout any of these hearings. I first met the President...
I really very much doubt that, Mr.
No,
Porter.
sir.
I've known Richard Nixon probably longer than you've been alive. And I really suspect that the greatest disservice that a man could do to a President of the United States would be to abdicate his conscience.
Well, I understand, Senator. I first met Mr. Nixon when I was 8 years old in 1946, when he ran for Congress in my home district. And I wore Nixon buttons when I was 8, and when I was 10, and when I was 12, and when I was 16. And my family worked for him. My father worked for him in campaigns. My mother worked for him in campaigns. I felt as if I had known this man all my life, not personally, perhaps, but in a spirit. I felt a deep sense of loyalty to him.
Mr.
And
Porter,
I
I'm
was
sorry.
appealed to on
I'm
that
sorry to
basis.
interrupt you at this point, but we have the warning bell on the roll call. I know you'll return, and when we do, we'll continue this, if we may.
Understand. Yes, sir.
In the Senate of the United States, a resolution to establish a select committee of the Senate to conduct an investigation and study of the extent, if any, to which illegal, improper, or unethical activities were engaged in by any persons acting individually or in combination with others in the presidential election of 1972, or any campaign, canvass, or other activity related to it.
From Washington, NPAC brings you gavel-to-gavel videotape coverage of today's hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here is NPAC senior correspondent Robert McNeil.
Good evening. Senator Ervin's Watergate investigation today successfully fought off several high-level attempts to curb its activities. Confronted with the first reluctant witness pleading the danger of a prejudiced trial, the committee unanimously voted to force him to testify under threat of contempt of the Senate. Chief Federal Judge John Sirica dismissed an attempt by Special Watergate Prosecutor Archibald Cox to black out television coverage of some witnesses before the committee. That applies immediately to the two men who reportedly have the most dramatic stories to tell, Jeb Stuart Magruder and John Dean. Judge Sirica granted both men immunity to appear. Magruder, number 2 man in the Nixon re-election committee, will probably appear tomorrow. And Dean, the White House counsel Mr. Nixon fired, will appear next week. Finally, both Republican and Democratic members of the committee briskly dismissed the much-publicized charge by Vice President Agnew that the televised investigation was a gross perversion of justice. The message from the committee today was full speed ahead and damn the torpedoes.
Judge Sirica's decision ended a delay of several weeks in getting immunity for Dean and Magruder. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox said he had no plans to appeal the Sirica decision. Sirica also ordered John Dean to appear before the federal grand jury here in Washington, and Dean did so later in the day, and according to press reports, took the Fifth Amendment.
There were 2 chief committee lawyers, Sam Dash and Fred Thompson, absent today. They were preparing for the next witness and prepping Jeb Stuart Magruder, who could answer a lot of the questions that have been raised in the past few weeks.
Georgetown University Law School here in Washington watched today's proceedings with us. Mr. Greenhall, Maurice Stan's testimony presented the committee with its first major legal hassle over the testimony of a witness, did it not?
Yes, it did. Robert Barker, who's chief counsel for Mr. Stans, leading a battery of attorneys in the hearing room, read a lengthy opening statement objecting to the hearings because he felt that they could prejudice his client's right to be tried by an impartial jury in another jurisdiction.
And Senator Ervin, as you will see, complimented Mr. Barker's presentation and then turned him down, and the whole shooting match continued. We'll be back with Bill Greenhall at the close of tonight's broadcast to discuss that and many other aspects of today's session. He will be joined by Alan Barth, Washington author journalist, who also watched today's session.
But no one even mentioned the Vesco case today except to assure one another that they weren't going to talk about it. They talked instead of the large amounts of cash that Stans handled, including $75,000 he'd handed over to Herbert Kalmbach, the president's personal lawyer, without even getting an explanation of what the money was going to be used for.
On the 29th of June, I received an urgent call from Mr. Kalmbach. He said he was in Washington at the Statler Hilton Hotel. It was extremely vital that he see me right away, and he wanted me to come over there, and I did. I dropped everything and went over to see him. He said, I'm here on a special mission on a White House project. I need all the cash I can get. He said, I don't have any cash to give you. Will you take a check? He said, no, I can't take a check. It must be in cash, and this has nothing to do with the campaign. But I'm asking for it on high authority.
What high authority did he say?
He did not say. I'm asking for it on high authority, and you will have to trust me that I have cleared it properly.
And later tonight, you'll hear Stans say which high authority that was in the White House. Between his testimony and that of Porter today, there was an eloquent debate over which branch of government should pursue the Watergate investigation. To help you plan your viewing, here is an hour-by-hour rundown of today's testimony. In the first hour, campaign scheduler Herbert Porter details what he spent cash on, including several payments to pranksters during the primaries. He admits purchasing equipment to use in viewing photographs of memos from Senator Muskie's headquarters. His secretary retyped some of them. The second hour finds Senator Ervin in a constitutional debate with Robert Barker, attorney for Maurice Stans. Barker, in urging a postponement of Stans' testimony, asks the committee where can he get a fair trial in the light of the blanket of publicity. In explaining why the Senate was moving ahead, Senator Ervin charges that the electoral process has been polluted. In the third hour, Finance Chief Maurice Stans testifies that he had no knowledge of either the Watergate operation or any campaign sabotage. When he's asked about a memo suggesting that Stans had a political fund within the Commerce Department, Stans says he knew nothing about it. In the fourth hour, Stans tells of a meeting with the president's personal attorney, Herbert Kalmbach. He says he gave Kalmbach $75,000 for a special mission, with authority, he said, from the White House. Later, Stans says John Dean called him and asked for $22,000 to replenish a White House fund. Stans says he doesn't know how the money was used. Now to the hearing itself. As Senator Ervin gavels the committee to order, the witness, Herbert Porter, continuing his testimony from last week.
The committee will come to order, and the witness will return to the stand. Let's see, who had, you remember whose last name? Senator Norrie, I believe it's your turn to question the witness. I believe that's right. No, I finished yesterday. I guess it's well, Senator Garney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Porter, to get caught up to date, as I understand it, you were the director of scheduling at the Committee to Re-elect the President, in charge of the Speakers Surrogates program and also the celebrities, entertainments, and athletes. And I think that the two pertinent pieces of testimony you gave us last week, it was that you had dispersed some $69,000 in this, I guess you might call it sabotage program, and that you also perjured yourself at the trial at Mr. Gruder's request on what you paid money to Liddy for. Now then, I'd like to clarify one or few points here. Would you explain to the committee how you dispersed the $69,000? I don't think that was gone into in much detail last week.
Yes, sir, I will. Pre-April 7th, I passed approximately $31,000 to Mr. Liddy. The purpose, the funds to be used for a purpose I was not aware of. I passed $8,000 to Mr. Richard Howard at the White House at Mr. Magruder's request.
What did he use that for?
I do not know, sir.
Did you ask Mr. Liddy what he was going to use his money for?
No, sir, I did not.
Go on.
Mr. Magruder instructed me to pass Mr. Liddy funds when he requested them, and I did not ask him what they were used for, nor did he tell me.
Go on.
I gave $300 at Mr. Magruder's direction to Mr. Douglas Hallett, who was at the White House, who worked on the, helped us put some reports together, and it was, I do know the purpose of that. That was to pay round-trip airfare for Mr. Hallett to California for Easter vacation because he had helped out on the campaign putting these reports together. I paid $1,100 to Lionel Hampton for a band appearance in a rally down in Miami, Florida in March. I I paid approximately $3,700 to $3,800 to a Roger Greaves in Los Angeles. I paid...
What was that for?
Mr. Greaves, on 2 occasions, promoted some sign-carrying placards to greet, I believe it was Senator Muskie, upon an airport arrival in Los Angeles, and also came on to the, was also paid for a period of about 2 weeks, served for about a period of about 2 weeks, and actually was paid a month's salary, in effect, to do some Dick, as I said the other day, some Dick Tuck type prank harassment in New Hampshire and Florida, and it lasted for about 2 weeks, and he went back to California.
Go on.
I gave $200 to Mr. Robert Mardian for an advance trip to California that he took, and the bank was closed. I gave approximately $300 to about, I would say, 7 or 8 people in various spots around the country to promote the president's campaign at opposing candidates' stops, signs that would say, "This is Nixon country," or whatever.
You gave each one that amount?
No, sir. Total aggregate, approximately $300 to pay for signs and paint and maybe a keg of beer afterwards or something like that. I paid $100, I believe approximately $100, or to Mr. Roger Stone on one occasion to go to New Hampshire to leave a leaflet, I believe, at Senator McGovern's headquarters. And I paid another $200 to Mr. Stone, the same Mr. Stone, to go a second time to New Hampshire to make a cash contribution to Mr. McCloskey's campaign. These were all at the direction of Mr. Magruder. I gave Tom Bell $350 at Mr. Magruder's direction for the printing of a small pamphlet having to do with Senator Muskie's candidacy. Approximately $25 went for stamps, and about $1,000 approximately went to Mr. Magruder on about probably 2 or 3 occasions where his aide would come and say, "Jeb wants $300 or Jeb wants $500 or something." I did not know the purpose of that. And I gave approximately $3,000 to Mr. Ken Reitz, who was then the youth director, or director of the President's youth campaign. The total amount that was passed in the pre-April 7th period was approximately $49,500. After April 7th, I gave $3,300 to Mr. Liddy at Mr. Magruder's direction for a purpose I did not know. I gave approximately $90 to my chief scheduler, Mr. Curtis Hurge, which I understand was passed on to his secretary to pay for her parking for 2 months rather than a raise. I gave another $450 over a 3-month period to the same Mr. Roger Stone for a salary supplement until such time as I could talk Mr. Odle into raising his salary to $550 a month. I gave $4,400 to Mr. Phil Joannou at Mr. Magruder's direction. I did not know the purpose of that money. I gave $4,000 to Mr. Robert Odle on 2 occasions of $2,000 each. I did not know the purpose of that money. I think I took out about $300 for cash expenses on the trip to California with the Mitchells and the Mardians and the Magruders and the LaRues on the weekend of the 17th. I gave $750 to Mr. Ken Reitz on 2 occasions. One, I think, a $300 payment, the other one a $450 payment. I think Mr. Reitz told me what that money was used for, but I don't remember whether it was the first or the second time that he told me, but I understand later it was for the young gentleman that was sitting out in front of the White House, Mr. Brill. And I made total payments of about $6,000 over a 3-month period. Again, to Mr. Stone, that was passed on to a Mike, I can't remember his last name again now. I believe it was McMinoway from Louisville, Kentucky, who worked in 2 or 3 of the primary campaigns as kind of an eyes and ears and kept the campaign, or kept Mr. Stone informed of morale and just kind of movements and that sort of thing. That totaled about $19,000. The total is approximately $69,000, $52,000 before April 7th and about $17,000 after April 7th.
When Mr. Sloan was testifying before us, he testified that he had given you $100,000, as I recall. Can you account for the discrepancy in your testimony and his?
Senator Gurney, this discrepancy was brought to my attention around early July of last year, and I, at that time, said that Mr. Sloan was wrong, and that it had been approximately $65,000 to $70,000, and that Mr. Reesner, I had asked independently to come in and check those amounts. Now, I can't account for it any other way than to tell you that that's my best memory of the approximate amount that Mr. Sloan passed to me. I noticed in Mr. Sloan's testimony on Thursday that the figure $100,000 that was up on the board, that was the one figure that he was a little unstable on and unsure of. And he did say, I believe, that he wasn't exactly sure of that amount, and that was the best of his memory.
Did you and he ever get together and reconcile?
No, sir, not at any
amounts
time.
Of money?
Never.
One thing that's been a puzzlement to me is why you dispersed money to Liddy at all, because Mr. Sloan also testified that he dispersed something like, seems to me, $199,000 to Liddy.
Yes, sir.
So why didn't Liddy go directly to Sloan for all the money? Why get some from you?
I don't know, sir. All I can tell you in answer to your question is that in December, Mr. Magruder told me that Mr. Liddy was going to come to me and that I was to get funds from Mr. Sloan. I was not aware that Mr. Sloan was also giving money to Mr. Liddy. The last money I gave to Mr. Liddy, I think should be pointed out, was in March of 1972, with the exception of the $3,300 that I was directed to give him in the early May of 72.
Did you know during any of this period of time that you were dispersing monies to Mr. Liddy, that he was also getting monies from Mr. Sloan?
No, sir, I did not.
In your testimony last week, too, you mentioned this conversation with Mr. Magruder after he had come from the White House, as I recall. And quoting from the record, you said, he also told me there were going to be several indictments and listed off a series of names, a number of names, people that he thought would be indicted. Who were these people that he thought would be indicted?
I believe, and I would ask the counsel's help on this one, I believe the names that he mentioned were Mr. Mitchell, Mr. LaRue, Mr. Mardian, himself, Mr. Magruder, Mr. Haldeman, Mr. Strawn, Mr. Dean, Mr. Colson, Mr. Dorson. Does that run the list? I don't remember. I think that's it.
Did you and he have any discussion as to why he thought they were implicated?
I'm sorry, Senator. What was the question?
I say, did you and he have any discussion at that particular time as to why he thought they would be indicted?
No, sir.
Now then, let's go to the California visit. That, of course, was when the news broke about the Watergate break-in out in California that morning. And you mentioned that you were at breakfast with a number of people. Now, who were these people?
Yes, sir. I came down to breakfast at about 8:30. This was at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And Mr. Caldera, who was working on the celebrities portion of the day and the activities of that weekend, was with me. We sat down at a table next to Mr. and Mrs. LaRue, Mr. and Mrs. Mardian, and Mr. and Mrs. Magruder. It was during that breakfast, or during that, and I was reading the paper, and I think Mr. Caldera was too, that I overheard Mr. Magruder say, "Does anyone know where I can find a secure phone?" And nobody did, apparently, and he leaned over and asked me, kind of leaned back in his chair over to the next table and said, "Do you know where I can find a secure phone?" And I said that we had a phone, an outside line up in the Mitchell suite, and he said, no, that wasn't good enough. And I said, why do you need it? And he said, well, Liddy wants to talk to me. And that was all he said. And I said, well, why don't you just go to a payphone and just pick a payphone at random and call him? I don't know whether he did that or not.
Did he leave the room then?
I don't believe so.
There was also testimony that I think it was your wife in a chat with Mrs. Magruder got the information that Mr. Magruder was on the phone all morning long, as I recall, with Key Biscayne. Can you amplify that any further? Do you know who he talked to?
All I can tell you about that conversation was that Mrs. Porter did mention to me that morning, Sunday morning, I guess she later has now told me that she went in to have a cup of coffee with Gail, I think, Mrs. Magruder, and our rooms were like across the hall, and I believe Mr. Magruder's parents at that time were with them also. And Carol came back and made a comment to me that Gail had said to her that Jeb had been up since very early in the morning, all morning, she said, on the phone to Key Biscayne. That was the net of the conversation.
Did you see Mr. Magruder at all the rest of the day?
On Sunday, Senator?
Yes.
I believe I saw him that morning. He introduced me to his parents, and I said hello to them. And
was there any conversation at any time during this day about the break-in?
No, sir, because Mr. Magruder was making arrangements at that time for air transportation back to Washington, and he left the group and flew back to Washington sometime Sunday morning, I believe.
What other people did you see during that day, that is, principals in this? Mr. Mitchell, Mr. LaRue, Mr. Marty, and anybody else?
Are you talking Saturday or Sunday, Senator?
Well, the day of the morning of the break-in.
Yes, sir. There was a meeting, a California political meeting at the Airport Marina Hotel at about 10 o'clock or 10:30, I believe, and the arrangements were that Governor Reagan was going to stop by the hotel and pick up Mr. Mitchell, which he did, and we went down to the Airport Marina Hotel, and it was at the Airport Marina Hotel that I began noticing a lot of rather private conversations going on.
Between whom?
Among Mr. LaRue, Mr. Mardian, Mr. Magruder, and then ultimately Mr. Mitchell. And there were several large banquet rooms, empty banquet rooms in the hotel that were not being used, and a lot of these meetings were held in those rooms off in a corner. And I was asked on one occasion to stand some 50 yards away or whatever it was and kind of as a guard on the door so they could have this meeting.
Who was present at that particular meeting?
Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Mardian, Mr. LaRue, Mr. Magruder, Mr. Clifford Miller from Los Angeles was present, but I'm not sure that he was present at that particular meeting. There were several of these conferences going on intermittently during the morning.
How many would you say?
3 or 4, probably.
And would you please name all the people that you can remember who participated in these conferences?
I think I've named them, Senator, those people.
Did you overhear any of the conversations?
No, sir, not a bit.
Did any of these people repeat to you later any part of these conversations?
No, sir. Obviously, my curiosity became piqued, and I asked, I believe it was Mr. Miller, I think it was Mr. Miller, probably a question like, what's up? And he said, I believe that one of the committee's employees had been caught inside the Democratic National Committee. And I asked him who it was, and he said James McCord. And that was the first time I had learned of that. And that was
how long did you stay
noon.
Excuse me. How long did you stay in California?
I personally, Senator?
Yes.
Through Tuesday, I believe, the following Tuesday.
And what about the rest of the time that you were in California? Do you recall any conversations that took place about Watergate that you have any knowledge of?
No, sir. At no time was I ever included in any of those conversations with any of those people.
While you were in California, did you make any phone calls back to Washington?
I have been asked, I believe, that question by one of the members of your committee. I received a phone call from the same Roger Stone who I mentioned earlier about my earlier testimony. And Mr. Stone was taking care of our house while we were gone. I had taken my family out to California for the summer.
Well, was this any...
He was, yes, sir, it's significant. He was, I think it was on Monday night, I guess feeding our dogs, and the phone rang, and a voice asked for me, and he said, is Bart Porter there? And Mr. Stone said, no, he wasn't. And he said, who's this? And the voice said that, it sounded like an older man, according to Roger. It said that this is Jim McCord. And Roger said, I don't believe you. And I guess the man pressed him and said, yes, it was. He said, where are you? And he said, well, I'm in jail. I want to talk to Porter. I don't think this is accurate. I think it was personally a hoax or some friend calling. But anyway, Roger called me in California immediately. And I was convinced it was a prank because I hardly knew Mr. McCord, and he would have no reason to call me. But because Mr. Magruder, I think I tried to get to Mr. Magruder, I'm not sure, but I did call Mr. LaRue. I felt somebody should know that I had received that call, and so I think I called Mr. LaRue and told him that, and he just took the information and said thank you, and that was the last I heard of it.
Now, when you returned to Washington, again, did you participate in any conferences, phone conversations with anyone about this Watergate break-in?
No, sir, not at all.
Did you hear anybody discuss it there at the committee to re-elect the president?
No, sir.
What about destruction of records? What records have you destroyed other than the accounting that you mentioned?
Well, I really didn't have any other records, Senator, other than some speech material and some travel schedules that were out of date, and other things that I had been kind of saving over a period of months that really were not, I wouldn't classify as anything important, nor I did have those, and I did throw those away, I think.
From the time that you were in the service of the committee to re-elect the president till now, have you ever had any discussions about Watergate or bugging or surveillance or sabotage with Mr. Haldeman?
Never.
With Mr. Ehrlichman?
Never.
With Mr. Dean?
Never.
With Mr. Colson?
Never.
With Mr. Kalmbach?
Never.
With Mr. Mitchell?
Never.
With anyone whose name I have not mentioned?
With anyone whose name you have not mentioned?
That's right.
Mr. Magruder,
aside from Mr. Magruder that we've heard about.
Yes, sir. I don't believe so, sir.
I understand.
I don't think so.
I understand you had a meeting on January 24, 1972 with Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Magruder. Is that
That's correct.
fact? What was the substance of that meeting?
The substance of that meeting was that many of us who had come on early in the campaign had been preparing a series of position papers and other reports on various aspects of the campaign. And although I was supposedly the director of scheduling, I had a few other duties that I had to perform, like putting together an ethnic report, a Middle American vote report, a Spanish-speaking, Spanish-American
I believe these were
report.
routine
Yes, sir. And
campaigns.
these were large documents, and Mr. Magruder set up a meeting on the 24th for me to deliver these reports to Mr. Mitchell. And
nothing occurred in this meeting about
No, sir.
bugging, surveillance,
No, sir, not at all.
sabotage. Just two final questions. Do you know of your own knowledge whether the President of the United States had any prior knowledge about Watergate,
No, sir, I do
bugging,
not.
surveillance?
No, sir, I do
Do you
not.
know of your own knowledge whether the President of the United States had any participation or knowledge of the cover-up?
No, sir, I do not.
Do you yourself have any knowledge of the cover-up?
Only to
Other
the-
than what you and Mr.
No, sir.
Magruder
Only the extent of my own involvement, and that's where it ends.
Thank you. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Senator Talmadge.
Porter, what was your position before assuming your post with the committee to re-elect the president?
Sir, I was a staff assistant to the president working in Mr. Herb Klein's office at the White House. principally in the same area, Senator Talmadge, in the Speaker's Bureau, responding to requests for speakers that would come in to the executive offices.
Who offered you that position?
I'm sorry, sir.
Who offered you that position?
I believe Mr. Magruder did back in January of 1971.
Now, why were you upset when Mr. Magruder suggested that the committee to re-elect the president files and records might be searched?
Well, sir, we had an extensive, as I understood it, an extensive advertising plan. We had our key state. That was quite a confidential plan of what states we were targeting, the amounts of money we were going to spend in each state, all the polling data we had, the research data we had, the plans for the telephone banks that ultimately were quite successful that we had. I mean, all those things. My whole surrogate planning schedule for the campaign. These were things that I understood could all be subpoenaed and made public.
You know of nothing illegal that was in the files?
No, sir, I do not.
That you do,
no, sir, I do not.
Excuse me, go ahead.
Yes, sir, I'm sorry.
The only thing you were concerned about was political information of a sensitive nature. Is that an accurate statement?
That's an accurate statement.
Did Mr. Magruder ever mention the president's name to you when he discussed with you this Watergate matter?
The president's name was mentioned, sir, in the context of save the president from embarrassment, doing this for the president. He never did he imply, nor did I infer that the President of the United States was aware of Mr. Magruder's request of me. No, sir.
Did he indicate to you that it's important to keep the investigators from getting to Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Haldeman, and the President?
No, sir. I think to answer the question directly, the answer would be no. However, Mr. Magruder did say, I believe, that it was important that the investigation be kept to the Watergate investigation and avoid the embarrassment that could be caused by having it go on to other areas. And he specifically mentioned Mr. Haldeman, Mr. Mitchell, and the President as being those, and I think those are the three he mentioned, that could be embarrassed.
That he wanted the information to investigators to be kept from the President, Mr. Mitchell, and Mr. Haldeman. Is that your testimony?
Mr. Magruder didn't key on the investigators as much as he did the opposition, the Democrats coming in.
What was the area of sensitivity there? Why did he mention those specific names?
I don't know, sir.
Did Magruder tell you that he talked with Mr. Mitchell about this matter?
Yes, sir.
What did he say Mr. Mitchell said?
He did not, sir. He said that as I have stated earlier, that he had come from a meeting where my name had been brought up, and in that context, he mentioned Mr. Mitchell's name.
What did he say Mr. Mitchell said?
He did not quote Mr. Mitchell directly.
Didn't say anything in that regard?
I think to answer that question would mean that I should say that Mr. Magruder, in stating those who were present at the meeting, I got a picture that there was a discussion of me and that he was bringing the message from the meeting. So in that context...
well, what was the nature of the meeting? What was it about?
I do not know, sir.
Well, what did Mr. Magruder tell you occurred at the meeting?
Mr. Magruder said that my name had come up and that there was, first of all, he said he wanted to assure me that no one higher than Mr. Liddy was involved in the Watergate. However, there was a problem with the authorized funds given to Mr. Liddy, and that apparently he had taken some of these authorized funds that had been authorized for what Mr. Magruder claimed to be legal purposes, but embarrassing purposes.
Well, how did your name arise in the conversation?
Well, Senator, they apparently had decided at this meeting that they wanted to be able to say or tell the investigators that the money had been authorized to Mr. Liddy for something, I believe my words the other day were a little bit more legitimate sounding than what they had been authorized for, and Mr. Magruder was going to do that and asked me, and I got the impression that I was being asked by the others also, to corroborate that story and to, in fact, replace one lawful authorization with another, one that would be less embarrassing, but one that was not in any way, in my opinion, and to my knowledge at the time, tied in any way to Watergate.
As I recall, you testified last week that Mr. Magruder urged you to commit perjury, did you not?
I didn't use those words, Senator.
That was the sum and substance of it, wasn't it?
Mr. Magruder asked me to corroborate and change the date of a conversation.
Did he say he was making that statement on his own initiative or authority, or that it came from high levels?
I don't believe that those words were used, but I certainly got the impression that they were from a group of people, not just Mr. Magruder.
What group do you think it was?
The group that he said was at the meeting, which was Mr.
Who was
Mitchell, Mr. Mitchell, Mr. LaRue, Mr. Magruder, and a fourth person whose name I have not been able to remember for
And
years.
you think that was the group that urged you to follow the Magruder pattern? Is that the idea?
Yes, sir, it is.
All right. Now, did Mr. Liddy ever give you some sealed envelopes?
Yes, he did.
How many times?
I would say 3 to 4 times.
What was his instructions when he gave you those envelopes?
Mr. Liddy asked me to hold them for him, and with the instruction that if anything should happen to him, that I should take those envelopes directly to the Attorney General.
And who was the Attorney General at the time?
Mr. Mitchell.
Did he tell you what the contents of those
No, sir,
sealed
he did not.
envelopes
They were sealed.
Were you curious about what they were?
I suppose
Did you have
retrospect, my curiosity was piqued somewhat, but I didn't, not enough to.
Did you have any impression at the time as to what those contents
No,
might
sir, I
be?
did not.
Did you ever wonder about the nature of it? Did he
I think
give
I
you
probably
sealed
wondered,
envelopes?
surely, Senator, I'd
Urge
be-
you that if anything happened to you, to give them to the Attorney General of the United
I'm
States?
sorry, sir, I missed the last question.
Did it excite curiosity in your mind that he would give you sealed envelopes and tell you and instruct you that if anything happened to him, you would deliver them to the Attorney General of the United States?
Yes, sir, I'm only human. I was naturally curious, but as I say, they were in my safe, and I forgot about them most of the time, quite frankly. but
Did
they
you
were there.
return them to Mr. Liddy after he came
No,
by?
sir. Mr. Liddy asked me on one occasion to shred them. He said, "You know those envelopes I gave you, go ahead and shred them."
And you would do so?
I did.
All 3 times?
Sir, no, I mean all at once. I believe the 4 envelopes that I had, 3 or 4 envelopes I had,
You shredded them at one time and not after he returned? And
Oh, no, sir,
authorized
no,
you to
I shredded them
shred
all at one time.
One at a time. Now, you testified last week about a meeting you had with Mr. Parkinson, whom I believe was a lawyer for the re-election of the president, was he not?
I'm not sure exactly which committee Mr. Parkinson represented, Senator, whether it was the Finance Committee or the Re-election Committee, but
At that time, I believe he directed you or suggested to you that you play ball by Magruder's rules, or what was the comment that he made at that time?
no, sir. I believe the conversation you're referring to, perhaps that the staff has put down, is that during the May 28th meeting that I had with Mr. Parkinson in his office at his request, Mr. Parkinson made a comment about me by Mr. Magruder. And I don't remember exactly what the comment was, but I said, well, that's kind of a strange thing for him to say or something. And he said, well, let me tell you exactly what he said. And he picked up a yellow notepad, and he had on it notes that he said he had taken from an earlier conversation with Mr. Magruder in his office. And he read from the bottom part of the page, and I quote him, Porter told to play ball by Mitchell, LaRue, Dean, and Magruder. Porter will not hold up under indictment. Then he flipped the page, and it said, Porter had meetings with Mitchell, Dean, LaRue, Magruder. And I looked at him rather incredulously, I think, and I said, well, first of all, Ken, I was never told to play ball by anybody. I never had a conversation with Mr. Mitchell or Mr. LaRue or Mr. Dean, but Mr. Magruder was the only one that I talked to. That the expression play ball was certainly never used, and I described to him again the conversation that Mr. Magruder had with me. Turning to the second paragraph, I never had any meetings after that with Mr. Mitchell or Mr. Dean. I may have had conversations with Mr. LaRue, but I wouldn't classify them as meetings. That was the extent of it.
Did anything else of significance occur at that conversation?
I believe I've already testified that Mr. Parkinson told me when I detailed my story to him that I had no problem, that I had not committed perjury, that I had embellished a story, that I shouldn't worry about it. And when I asked him if he thought it wise for me to get a lawyer or in this thing at all, he said no. I was certainly entitled to do so, but he thought that would be a little disruptive at that point, and it would take too long for a new lawyer to come in and learn all the facts on the case. And we were referring now to the civil suit filed by the Democrats in which I was named as a defendant. And so I took that advice and left.
Thank you, Mr. Porter. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No further questions.
Senator Weicker.
Mr. Porter, I'd just like to cover two areas. And first of all, in disbursement of the monies, the list of which you gave to Senator Gurney, did you mention in that list the purchase of microfilm viewing equipment?
No, sir, I did not. And that should be in there.
You did not mention it in the list that you gave to Senator Gurney?
No, sir. I probably, in my own mind, I had that classified under the REITs, under the REITs money, but I did not specifically mention it.
Well, is it REITs money, or is there a separate expenditure there?
It is a separate expenditure, Senator.
Then could you give me the amount of that expenditure?
I believe it was probably $60, $50 or $60, something like that.
In the nature of microfilm viewing equipment?
Yes, sir. Well, I wouldn't classify it as microfilm viewing equipment. I would classify it as a film strip viewing equipment, 35 millimeter film strip, not microfilm.
Now, you say you thought you had this classified in your mind under the REITs payments, but isn't it so that you gave this money to your secretary, Martha Duncan?
No, sir. I don't believe so.
You gave no money then to your secretary to purchase microfilm viewing equipment?
No, sir, I don't believe so. I did not. If you'd like me to tell you what I know about buying any equipment, I certainly can, but I don't remember giving Miss Duncan. At least nothing was ever purchased as a result of it.
You never instructed your secretary to purchase viewing equipment for microfilms?
Senator, I don't remember. I think at the time that Mr. Magruder brought some 35 millimeter negative film to me on occasion, I remember looking for a better viewing vehicle than a little tiny thing that you had to hold up to your eye. And I did go, I believe, to one or two camera stores around close to the committee and look for a 35 millimeter film strip projector. Now, it's possible that I might have asked Miss Duncan on a lunch hour or something to go to one of these places to see if she could find one or see if she knew where I could get one. I was having trouble finding one, and I ended up getting one in New York, or out of a New York company. So Miss Duncan did not purchase any of that equipment, to my knowledge.
What was the purpose of this equipment?
The purpose of the equipment was to view 35 millimeter film strips that were given to me.
And what was the nature of those film strips?
The nature of the film strips were that they appeared to be 35 millimeter photographs or negatives of intra-office memos from Senator Muskie's campaign headquarters to his Senate offices and back again.
And did you give any sort of an admonition to your secretary, Ms. Duncan, as to whether or not she was free to talk about these matters?
I think there was a general understanding, Senator, at the time that it wasn't anything you went to a party and talked about, if that's an answer to the question.
Well, I want to know exactly what Mrs. Duncan's function was in relation to these particular microphones.
Well, let me back up, Senator, to answer the question, I think, a little more fully and put it in context. At a certain time, and I don't remember the exact month, November perhaps of 1971, Mr. Magruder came into my office with a small roll, very small roll of 35 millimeter film strip and a little viewing device that had a little light source from the back. And he said, "Here, hold these for me. Put them in my safe or desk or whatever I had at the time." I asked him what they were, and he said, "Well, you can look at them, but never mind." So I looked at them, and they were apparently, as I say, inter-office memos from staff members in Senator Muskie's office. He came back later, I think a day later perhaps, and retrieved the film strips, took them, and said that he was going to show them to Mr. Mitchell. He came back, and apparently he did show them to Mr. Mitchell because he was a little irate at me for not making sure that the batteries worked. And apparently he got all the way to Mr. Mitchell's office and the batteries didn't work, and he blamed it on me. But anyway, after that time, and he gave the film strips back to me, I would say there were probably 4 or 5 frames on the strip. I think I asked Mr. Magruder where he got them, and he refused to tell me at that time. At a later date, Mr. Magruder said that Mr. Ken Reitz was going to deliver these film strips to me, and would I view them and for him, for Mr. Magruder, and anything that I thought was, quote, important or interesting that I should bring to Mr. Magruder's attention, and he would then tell me what to do with it. I did that, and Mr. Reitz started delivering these things to me, and I did view them, and I think the first or second time that I did this, it became apparent that I needed something a little more easy on the eye, perhaps, to see what these things said, and so I then went out and out of my own pocket, I think, wrote a check for just a small little projection device so that you could see it, you could enlarge it and see what it said.
All right, now, that's, let's take it right at that point. Did your secretary participate in typing any transcripts or memorandum based on these microfilms?
Yes, sir. She did. On one occasion, I remember there was I think it was in December, early December, there was a staff memo that I saw from one of the campaign officials to the senator, or perhaps to his campaign manager, saying that the senator's role, I believe, as chairman of a subcommittee on governmental operations or something like that.
Which senator is this?
Senator Muskie.
Senator Muskie.
Could be used as a great front to go to California and hold tax hearings. That would be a great visual event for Senator Muskie and all at the at the taxpayer's expense and could get a lot of value for his campaign. We thought that was rather interesting, to say the least, and I told Mr. Magruder about it, and he asked me to just copy the memo on I believe it was written on plain bond, and send it to Evans and Novak. Miss Duncan did that. Miss Duncan typed it, and we sent it to Evans and Novak, and they printed it, and the hearings were never held.
All right. Were there other documents or other instances where Ms. Duncan performed services relative to...
Yes, sir. I believe it was Ms. Duncan. On one occasion, Senator Muskie's speech that he was going to deliver in the Senate against the nomination of William Rehnquist to the Supreme Court was on the film, and I specifically, it was about 20 pages, and I asked Mr. Magruder what he wanted me to do with it, and he said, let me check. And he did check, and he got back to me and said, Mr. Mitchell would like to see it. And so that had to be completely typed, and I had to I read off the film into an IBM dictaphone, and I believe it was Miss Duncan who typed that. I believe it was she.
Ms. Duncan now being your secretary,
yes,
is
sir.
that correct?
Yes, sir.
At any time did you send Ms. Duncan to the White House to give Gordon Strachan copies of the photograph documents or the transcripts emanating from those documents?
I don't remember, sir, whether I did or not. I do not remember. It's possible that I did. If I did, it would have been because Mr. Magruder would have said, take a copy of this over to Gordon Strachan.
I want you to be. I do want you to think about this answer.
I understand, and I think I do remember.
I'm not trying to mislead you on it, and if you care to take a minute here or so, just to carefully think about, please do so. I don't want to rush you.
I think I will tell it as I remember it, and I do. Let me say this: certainly, if Miss Duncan says that happened, then it did happen. I will not dispute anything that she might say. On the other hand, the only reason that I would send a document over to Mr. Strachan would be at Mr. Magruder's suggestion or direction. I believe that I do remember sending. I believe there was only one copy of the Rehnquist speech put together. I think it was so long. However, on the item that appeared that was sent to Evans and Novak, I think perhaps that may have been sent over to Mr. Strachan. I just don't remember, Senator.
And you realized at that time that these various documents, let me rephrase my question. The obtaining of these documents, did you consider them to have been obtained legally or illegally?
I remember asking Mr. Reitz, the first question I asked him, I said, is this any part of the U.S. mail? And he said no. I knew that intercepting the U.S. mail would be a violation of the law. I put the photographing of a document in the same category as Xeroxing a document. If you're taking a picture of it one way, you're taking a picture of it another way. So I did not think it was illegal. I thought it was very surreptitious, but I did not think it was illegal.
Thought it was surreptitious?
Yes, sir.
But you didn't think that it was illegal?
No, sir.
Why then did you indicate to your secretary that these were not matters to be discussed?
I think that's, in my opinion, that would be self-evident, Senator Weicker, that you wouldn't go around discussing things like that, the same as you wouldn't go around discussing any kind of information gathering that you might be doing.
Did you indicate to her that if she discussed it, she'd be fired?
I don't believe I've ever made that statement to her, no, sir.
Again, let me just ask the question. Am I correct in paraphrasing your answer to me that there might have been an instance where you sent material to the White House, to Gordon Strachan, or am I correct in saying that there were those instances, and if so, how many? That's my question.
I cannot remember the exact number of instances that I sent things to Mr. Strachan. Mr. Strachan would get copies addressed to Mr. Haldeman of many things that I did, Senator, in relationship to my primary function at the campaign of the surrogate operation, and schedules and plans.
No, I understand that, but
I don't remember. Excuse me.
Excuse me.
Well, I just don't remember specific instances where Mr. Strachan was sent an item here or an item there. As I say, if Ms. Duncan says that she did, then I would believe that. But I personally don't remember that specific instance.
You do not remember, then, sending Ms. Duncan to the White House to give Gordon Strachan copies of these photographed documents?
I would say that if it's an answer, I kind of remember it, but not enough to sit and testify that I did it. All right. I mean, I sent Mr. Strachan documents, and on occasion Ms. Duncan would hand carry them for one reason or another, either because the messenger wasn't going to come back till 4 o'clock and it was noon, or Mr. Magruder wanted to get something over there right away, or something like that, and the secretaries would hand carry them.
I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
So in the first hour of testimony, Mr. Porter has given us far more information than we had before about the extent of the espionage on Senator Muskie's campaign. That memos, staff memos in his campaign were photographed and copied by Mr. Porter and may have been forwarded to the White House. In a moment, he'll be asked about documents that he destroyed after the Watergate break-in. We'd just like to say, while we take a pause, that we are very gratified with the viewer response to this gavel-to-gavel experimental coverage of the Watergate hearings on public television. The response has been enormous in the mail, and if any of you still want to express an opinion about it, we suggest that you do it to your local public television station, the station you're watching now. After all, it is that station which depends on your support, and which, incidentally, in the public television system, actually makes the individual decision on whether to carry programs of this kind. Public television's coverage of the hearings will continue after this pause for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of these hearings is provided as a public service by the member stations of PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service.
As the hearings resume, hour number 2 will include more questions put to Herbert Porter and some praise for his testimony. And that involves some of Senator Ervin's now famous use of Shakespearean quotations to characterize witnesses.
Senator Montoya.
Well, Mr. Porter, I believe at one stage of your testimony you stated that you had been instructed by Mr. LaRue, Mr. Magruder, Mr. Parkinson, and Mr. O'Brien not to mention Mr. Reasoner in your testimony.
Yes, sir. I think, again, I'm not sure that I stated it exactly that way. I think what I stated was that Mr. Magruder specifically asked me not to bring up Mr. Reasoner's name to the FBI or to the grand jury. Mr. Parkinson...
Did you ask him for any reasons why?
I believe I asked Mr. Magruder why, and he said, Bob's not involved in any of this. He's a young guy. I wanted to leave him. You know, it doesn't do any good to drag his name into it. Words to that effect. Those were the same words I think that Mr. Parkinson used. Oh, you know, he's a younger fellow, and he doesn't need to be dragged into this thing.
Well,
you don't have to mention his name, don't mention it.
Did you know at the time that he might or could have been involved?
No, sir, I did not.
Mm-hmm. What was Mr. Reasoner's capacity or position in the CRP at that time?
Mr. Reasoner was Mr. Magruder's administrative assistant.
And pursuant to your conversation with Mr. Parkinson and the other people, you did appear before the FBI, or you were interviewed by the FBI. You did appear before the grand jury, and you did appear before the U.S. Attorney, did you not?
I did appear before the FBI. They did interview me. I did appear before the grand jury on one occasion, and I did appear at the trial of Mr. Liddy and Mr. McCord.
And the testimony which you had used at all three places was with respect to the disbursement of approximately $100,000?
No, sir. That's not correct.
What was your testimony?
My testimony was that I gave Mr. Liddy approximately $30,000 to $35,000, which is correct. What I stated that was not correct was that Mr. Magruder had asked me in December how much a program of infiltrating radical organizations would cost, and I told him that it might cost $100,000. Mr. Magruder, I understand, used that as a basis, that conversation as a basis to then say that he had authorized Mr. Liddy $100,000 for the infiltration of radical groups so that he wouldn't have to say that he gave authorized $100,000 to Mr. Liddy for dirty tricks.
Well, there was
excuse me.
There was a dialogue between you and Mr. Magruder with respect to the figures about which you would testify before the grand jury, namely $100,000 or $80,000. Was there not?
No, Senator. I think what you're referring to is that the $100,000 figure that I testified to was a hypothetical figure. I never testified.
I understand that, Mr. Porter. You mentioned this in a conversation with Mr. Magruder, indicating to him that he could justify the expenditure of $100,000 by hiring 10 students.
Yes, sir.
But what figure did you testify to before the grand jury and at the trial?
Which figure are you referring to, Senator Montoya? The money I gave to Mr. Liddy, or the money that...
That is correct.
I testified at the FBI and to the grand jury and to the trial that I gave Mr. Liddy a total, pre-April 7th, of approximately $35,000.
Where did the $100,000 enter into other than, as you have mentioned, with respect to the illustrative case that you have referred to?
It did not.
All right. Now, when you went to Mr. Parkinson's office, did he at any time indicate to you that Mr. Magruder was going to contend that there had been a delivery of $100,000 to Mr. Liddy?
No, sir.
Now, did you at any time visit Mr. Silbert?
I have visited Mr. Silbert recently, sir.
Did you, during those days when you were conversing with Mr. Magruder about a possible appearance that he might make at Mr. Silbert's office, did you at that time visit Mr. Silbert?
No, I did not, sir.
Did you ask Mr. Magruder or Mr. LaRue for a government job during your discussions with them about your grand jury testimony?
To answer that question specifically, I would have to answer no, but there's some yes in it, and if I could perhaps explain that. In January of this year, when we were getting through with the President's inauguration, obviously the thoughts turned to future employment. And I got, Mr. Magruder told me that I believe it was Mr. Malek at the White House could possibly be an obstruction to my getting a good job with the government. And I asked Mr. Magruder what he thought I should do about it. And he said, I think Mr. Mitchell could probably help you a little bit. He's, still got some clout there. And so I said, well, what's the best way to do that? Should I call him directly or what? And he said, no, why don't you talk to Fred LaRue? So I believe I went over and talked to Mr. LaRue, and the conversation went something like my saying, Fred, the problem that I have with Mr. Malek, I said, I have been a pretty loyal guy, and he said, yes, I know that. And I said, I don't want to be treated any better than anybody else, but I sure as heck don't want to be treated any worse than anybody else either. And do you think that Mr. Mitchell could perhaps make a call and unloose the logjam a little bit? And he said, yes, I'll call him. And I understand that he did. That was the extent of that conversation.
Why were you concerned about Mr. Malik obstructing any move that you might make?
Mr. Malik was in charge of handing out government jobs, Senator, and it didn't sound too good when I heard that he perhaps could be an obstruction to my getting one. And
what reason did you have to believe that?
Well, I think it was strictly personal, Senator.
Was
it between Mr. Malik and me.
Was it your understanding around the CRP that on important decisions that Mr. Haldeman should be informed?
Yes, sir.
And what sphere of decisions would you say covered any communications between the CRP and Mr. Haldeman at the White House?
Senator, I can only, I would have to confine my answer to my area of involvement in the surrogate scheduling program, but everything that I did, all reports, all plans, all schedules, all states, key states, times, etc., were all sent to Mr. Haldeman. And
would that include disbursements?
Sir, I'm not aware of that. I was never asked to give Mr. Haldeman or anybody like that any...
Well, would you say definitely that it did not include disbursements?
I would say that to my knowledge, it did not include any of the disbursements that I made, but that's as far as I could go.
And you mentioned that for every disbursement which you made, you had received a receipt.
Yes, sir.
From the recipient.
Yes, sir.
And how long did you keep these receipts?
The initial receipts from the pre-April 7th money I kept until the end of March, I believe, when Mr. Sloan asked me to balance with him. I did. The figure was approximately $52,000. I had balanced. I had no reason to keep the receipts any longer. Excuse me. And so I threw them away. I had additional receipts that were in my possession until after the Watergate break-in, and I would say approximately a week or 10 days after the break-in. I believe it was Mr. LaRue came by my office and said, if you have anything that might be politically sensitive or whatever, again, using the immediate discovery story, the Democrat civil suit, why don't you just throw it away? And so I kind of went through a few things, and I didn't think I had anything politically sensitive, but in that same process, I did ask Mr. Reasoner to come in again. We did balance, and Mr. Reasoner was made aware of the money and the cash on hand and the amount of money received from Mr. Sloan, etc., and those receipts then were thrown away.
Who did you show these receipts to before you destroyed them?
Mr. Reasoner.
Did you show these receipts to Mr. Magruder?
I don't believe so, but it's my understanding that Mr. Reasoner relayed the information to Mr. Magruder. At least that's what he has told me.
And what was so sensitive with respect to Watergate and these receipts that you, in your own discretion, destroyed them?
No, sir, I never said there was any relation to Watergate at all. And I don't put anything in the category that I relayed to you involving any of the payments that I made after April 7th to Watergate.
Well, just mention or state to me what sensitivity did you find in those receipts that warranted their destruction?
Yes, sir. Well, as I say, Mr. LaRue had come to my office and had asked me to throw away anything that could be in the category of being politically sensitive. I put in that category payments to Mr. Odell during the mining of the Haiphong Harbor, and payments to Mr. Joannou, which I later learned was for an ad in the New York Times. I felt that those were politically sensitive enough that I should not keep them.
Well, what others?
Well, sir, I didn't. If I was going to throw away 2 or 3, I just took them all through. Again, I had balanced with Mr. Reasoner and had no need to keep them.
Well, you must.
In other words, it was strictly in a.
You must be able to recall other instances and the sensitivity.
No, sir, I do not.
That you placed on those receipts?
No, sir, I do not. As I have stated, I had balanced with Mr. Reasoner. I did not have an accounting function at the committee. The receipts were strictly internal documents. They were not meant for any public viewing at all, and they were strictly internal, and I had satisfied the internal requirement, and I destroyed them. I threw them away.
How many receipts would you say that you destroyed? Can you estimate that?
The second time, sir? After the Watergate break-in? I would say approximately 10.
And did you destroy other documents?
I had some, as I say, travel schedules and old speeches and position papers and that sort of thing from some of the potential candidates that I had been keeping that I threw away.
Now, what were your exact duties at the CRP besides scheduling? What other duties did you have?
Well, sir, as I said in one of my earlier statements, almost all of my time was spent in the surrogate scheduling, planning for the surrogate program, which amounted to over 1,000 man-days of campaigning on the part of the surrogates, all their schedules, talking with state chairmen and their appointed agents all over the country, working on airline schedules.
Mr. Porter, I don't mean any duties pertaining to your scheduling and being out in the field. I say within the CRP, in-house, what other duties did you perform?
Other than those that I've described, sir, that was it.
In other words, you were the one who would give instructions to Mr. Sloan for the disbursement of money.
Beg your pardon, sir?
You were the one that would give instructions to Mr. Sloan for the disbursement of money, or you would receive the money from Mr. Sloan and in turn give money to individuals such as Mr. Liddy.
That's right. I received my instructions from Mr. Magruder on who was to get certain funds and approximately how much. And I did go to Mr. Sloan, and I did get those funds, and I did pass them on to various individuals. As I stated to Senator Baker, I believe, on Thursday, of the some $69,000 that went through me from Sloan to others, that in going back about 75% of that, I did not know what the money was being used for at the time. I served as I guess more or less a bank teller, really, or a messenger to go down and pick it up.
That's all, Mr. Chairman.
I have just 1 or 2 questions.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Porter, you give the appearance of a man who's brought up in a good home.
Thank you, sir.
And you undoubtedly taught that it's an obligation of a citizen to testify truthfully when he's called on to testify on oath before a grand jury or a petty jury.
Yes, sir.
But you were persuaded not to do so with respect to the non-existent conversation between you and Magruder in December 1971 by Magruder's insistence that your loyalty to the president required you to go along with him on that proposition.
I would say that's basically.
And then later you applied for a position with the government and did not receive it.
I would say a more accurate response to that is that I encountered quite a bit of difficulty in getting it, and finally did receive an offer which I received on my own initiative.
Yes. Well, there was a wise man.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, and rejected it.
Yes. There was a wise man named William Shakespeare that wrote a play called Henry IV. And in that he has one of his characters, Cardinal Wolsey, say, after Cardinal Wolsey, instead of serving the church, had served his king, and he was cast out in his old age with the king, and he said, had I but served my God with half the zeal I served my king, he would not, in mine age, left me naked to mine enemies. You have some questions? You have a question? hands cut out to applause. Some debate.
Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions. I thank Mr. Porter for long, arduous testimony. He's been here now for the better part of 2 days. We've covered a lot of material. Very frankly, there's a lot more material to cover. As Mr. Porter will recall, when I first examined him, I asked him if he was prepared to return and ask other questions on other subjects, and you indicated that you were. In the interest of time and orderliness, the committee has tried in an informal way to compartmentalize these proceedings to particular subject matters. So we've omitted to ask certain questions. We have not probed in great depth into other matters, but we intend to do that, and I understand you are fully agreeable to returning to testify. Thank you very much, Mr. Porter.
Counsel have some concluding questions.
I have 2 or 3 questions along the lines we've been talking about, Mr. Porter. First, did you ever meet privately with any assistant U.S. attorneys before your grand jury appearance that led to the September indictments?
No, sir, I did not.
Now, in your conversations with...
That's correct, I did not.
Now, in your interview with the Federal Bureau of Investigation or your testimony before the grand jury, were you ever asked for example, the sums of money, the denominations of money which you gave to Mr. Liddy?
Yes, sir.
And what did you say?
The same thing I've stated to this committee. The sums were, the total amount, aggregate, was approximately $32,000, and the individual amounts ranged anywhere from, I think, $500 to, on one occasion, $6,000.
Were you ever asked, in view of the fact that the program required setting up of 10 individuals at $1,000 a month, why the units you gave Mr. Liddy were not in units of $1,000 or aggregated $10,000 a month?
No, sir, I don't believe so.
Was it your understanding that the conversation which you had with Mr. Magruder, according to your testimony,
yes, sir,
would provide the justification for your having paid Mr. Liddy the sum of $30,000 or so?
Mr. Dorson, I never testified. In fact, let me state it positively. I testified that I did not know specifically what Mr. Liddy did with the money I gave him. I also testified that I gave him a total of approximately $35,000.
But am I correct that your supposed conversation with Mr. Magruder, the one that never took place,
yes, sir,
was supposed to provide a justification for the large sums of money given by you to Mr. Liddy? Is that correct?
It's my understanding that part of the money that I gave to Mr. Liddy was supposedly going to be justified under that basis, and that later I learned that there was a substantial sum that Mr. Sloan had given him, which I had not been aware of.
Were you asked by the FBI or before the grand jury any other questions concerning the use of the money you gave Mr. Liddy, such as whether you asked Mr. Liddy whether there were infiltrators, whether Mr. Liddy indicated there were infiltrators, or anything along those lines?
Not that I remember.
Now, Mr. Porter, you have stated today that at no time did you request immunity from the United States Attorney's Office, and in fact, I know that you have not requested immunity from this committee. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And I assume also that you have no desire to be indicted for perjury. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And could you please tell the committee then why at no time did you or I assume your counsel seek immunity?
I guess, Mr. Dorson, that would really have to go, to answer that question fully, I would have to go back to Senator Baker's rather searching questions on Thursday. No matter how much a person prepares, he thinks he's prepared to answer a question like that, and then it turns out when he's faced with it, he fumbles a bit. And I have done a lot of reflecting on those questions and why I did what I did and why I'm here doing what I'm doing now. Many of the reasons the normal reasons that you read about in the newspaper and you hear about that people do things like that were not present in my case. I did not do it for money. I did not take a bribe. I didn't do it for power. I didn't do it for position. I didn't do it to hide anything I had done because I didn't think I had done anything. And yet, on the other hand, there were three or four factors that probably weighed, and I can't put any percentage on which weighed more or which toppled me over to the other side. My vanity was appealed to when I was told that my name had been brought up in high councils and that I was an honest man and made a good appearance and that sort of thing. My loyalty was appealed to the president. It was the heat of the campaign. A campaign, as I'm sure every one of you senators know, is an abnormal situation. You react, you act and react, and you spend most of your time reacting. And I think all of those things, coupled with what I have found now to be a weakness in my character, quite frankly, to succumb to that pressure, all added up to my tipping over to that side. Having discovered that weakness and having determined that the context in which what I did has been put, the first thing I told my attorney, I said, I want to go down and I want to tell the truth and I don't want to hide behind a darn thing. And I have not tried to make any deals with anybody. And as they say, I have not come to this committee to do so. Senator Baker used the word atonement the other day. Perhaps that's what I'm doing. I don't know. I let others judge that. But that's the way I feel, and that's what I'm doing.
I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
I have one question I'd like to put to the witness. From time to time, these people that you employed in the prank or sabotage department made reports to you, did they not?
On a couple of occasions, I believe they wrote letters and explaining what it was they had done. Yes, sir.
I'm not interested in the substance of the reports. Did they make reports to you by phone conversations?
The first gentleman, Mr. Greaves, talked to me a couple of times on the telephone. Yes, sir. And but he, as I say, he was only on board, so to speak, for a very short period of time, 2 weeks. So I don't believe there were any written reports at all, or any kind of, no reports were required. The second fellow, I believe, sent one handwritten statement that was later, I think, retyped and shown to Mr. Magruder, but it was brief, maybe about a page long, page and a half, and had to do with his activities in a field office of Senator Humphreys up in Pennsylvania someplace, or something like that.
Well, now, these reports, whatever nature they were, whether phone calls
Senator,
or conversations, who did you report to about what they were doing?
Mr. Magruder.
Did you report to anyone else?
No, sir.
Did you report by written memorandum?
I believe on one occasion I did report on the, as I say, it was a narrative of the man's letter that he had sent on his activities in this field office in Pennsylvania.
Do you
that
know?
Was the only one, as I remember.
Do you know if Mr. Magruder made a report to anyone about these activities?
I do not. I would expect that perhaps Mr. Magruder may have taken that document or that report and shown it to somebody.
But you and Mr. Magruder never discussed this? Whether he
No, sir, I don't think so. I think I gave it to Mr. Reasoner, as a matter of fact, and Mr. Reasoner had it and then gave it back to me.
This is the written report you're talking
Yes,
about?
sir.
Did Mr. Reasoner say what he did with it?
No, sir, he did not.
Did you make any reports at all to anyone in the White House during...
No, sir.
You did not?
No, sir.
Either during your term with the committee to re-elect the president or afterward?
Senator, on this particular subject matter, or in all the things I was doing in my role as surrogate scheduler?
I'm not talking about the legal activities. I'm talking about Watergate, bugging, surveillance, sabotage, cover-up, all these activities.
Sir, I did not know anything about the Watergate. The only part of any so-called cover-up that I was aware of was the part that I knew about, that I had said, and that was it, and I did not put that in the context of Watergate cover-up. But on any other things, there were no written reports to my knowledge at all.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I understand Senator Narwee has a question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Porter, You have testified that you have been in charge of the scheduling of surrogate speakers. Did you schedule the appearance of the acting FBI director, Mr. Gray?
No, sir, I did not.
Who
Mr. Gray's activities or scheduling were handled out of the White House, it's my understanding. He was not a surrogate for the campaign.
Do you know who did the scheduling, sir?
I do not know firsthand. I have read in the newspaper reports that it was out of the White House Speakers Bureau.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Bible bestows a blessing on him who sweareth to his own hurt and changeth not. I think you entitled that blessing. I want to commend you on the forthrightness of your testimony before this committee. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, before the witness is dismissed, I want to join in that expression to the witness. I must say that he and I treaded on delicate and painful ground on Thursday. And I think you were very manly in the way you reacted to probing and searching questions. It's not an easy job you've undertaken, and the committee is not here to sit in judgment on your guilt or innocence. But the committee is privileged, I think, to comment on your forthcoming testimony and spirit. So while we have used your testimony to probe and explore the atmosphere of campaigning, I hope we have not left the impression that we have done so with an absence of sensibility for your own situation and your own private concerns. I think you're to be commended for appearing and testifying. The committee is grateful, and I am grateful.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Your excuse now subject to recall if some future date of committee desires.
Yes, sir.
Well, that completes the testimony of Herbert L. Porter, the last of the little fishes we're going to hear from for a while. Porter confessed on national television to having committed a crime. And on a very human level, you can't help but wonder at this point what's next in the life of Herbert L. Porter. Public television's uninterrupted coverage of the Watergate hearings will continue after this pause for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of these hearings is provided as a public service by the member stations of PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service.